Kirti Matora. I'm here to share some information with you about making your garden a wildlife habitat. So the first thing you need to think about is your wildlife will need food, water, and shelter. There are different food, water, and shelter needs for different types of wildlife. Think about what you want to attract into your garden and be practical about that. Depending on where you're located, and definitely you want to make sure that wildlife is safe from our domestic pets. Taking a look at food, you could use a range of feeders. I am the laziest gardener on earth, so my choice, my preference, is to depend upon my plants for providing all the food needs of the wildlife I would like to have visit my garden space. And that way I don't have to worry about feeding or filling feeders or keeping them clean. So no matter what type of food source, you can make a habitat that would provide this. A lot of our native and other desert adapted trees and shrubs will offer a great range of seed resources for different birds and ground squirrels, other wildlife. So many different cycles through the season will be providing seed pretty much on a consistent basis if you have a nice variety of plants in your landscape. And also a lot of our perennials with their beautiful blooms, they will produce a good amount of seed for wildlife. Some of our wildlife friends will be visiting flowers. So they might be collecting pollen, they might be collecting nectar. Some of them might even be munching on the flowers, but we want to have, again, a range of different plants for them and to reach their needs. Some plants will be a source of food through their foliage or flower material, depending on the different types of wildlife. And fruit. A lot of our plants produce edible fruits for people and also a good amount of wildlife visitors. So keep that in mind also. With our plants, as they go through the cycle of the year, they're going to be providing different food sources for different wildlife. Many of our cactus produce just luscious fruits that any type of wildlife would really enjoy. Some of these fruits are only available to winged creatures because they're up so high, but sometimes those ground dwellers are fortunate and a fruit will fall to the ground and they can take advantage of that good tasty treat. So many insects are a protein source. Pretty much all of our birds at some point in their life, if not through their entire life, need protein sources from insects. So keep that in mind and don't be out there, trying to eliminate every insect. When I find a lot of times when I'm gardening, when I'm planting new material, I'm kind of disturbing things in the soil, and those birds, like the thrashers and the mockingbirds, they'll show up and start gobbling up little grubs that might be present in the soil. Water is a very, very precious resource for not only us humans here in the valley, but also your wildlife. I do want to recommend, if you are going to provide a source of water, make sure it's consistent. For those of you who might leave for a period of time during the year, if you cut off your water source, that's kind of cruel if different birds or other animals have become dependent upon that source of water. So you might have water that's circulating, such as in these examples, and birds will use water for different things, of course, for drinking, but a lot of the birds will enjoy a bird bath, literally, and hummingbirds just love to get in there and get all clean, especially in the early morning. You could use a different range or different styles of bird baths. Just make sure that you have that clean source of water. You need to be diligent if the water isn't recirculating and keeping the system clean itself, and even at that you'll need to clean it periodically. But otherwise, make sure that you get there and flush out that water every day or at least every other day so that that water is clean. We wouldn't want to be drinking stale, dirty water, and we don't want our wildlife visitors to be faced with that as well. If you're supplying water at ground level, just make sure the area is secure from predators, meaning our domestic friends. And also, it's a good idea if you do have a bird bath, make sure that there is a way out for any creatures, even with a few inches of water, they might get stuck. So having some little rocks or something, some way for them to hop up and climb out is a good idea. Not all of wildlife will be taking in or utilizing standing water. Bees, for instance, they won't come drink from a big pan of water or a dish of water. Neither will butterflies. The butterflies do what we call puddling, so damp soil is great for them. They're taking in moisture, but also a lot of minerals. Same thing with the bees. So make sure you're accommodating them to meet their needs as well. And it's so easy to do. For your butterflies, if you don't have that more consistently moist little area of soil, you could have a dish filled with sand and periodically renew that, but keeping that moist, it's a great source of moisture for the butterflies. So food, water, shelter. There are such a range of shelters that are needed by different forms of wildlife. And it's always great to have layers within your landscape that will accommodate needs of different animals and needs of those animals at different times of the day or night. Also, again, a nice variety is the best way to go in your landscape. When we can, it's also wonderful. If you have a native tree that tends to grow multi-trunked or multi-branched from the base, if you have enough space, let it grow like that. That is fabulous habitat for smaller animals. It's good shelter, protecting them from predators. You might need a specific type of setup if you're interested in something like a desert tortoise. And that's a whole nother world in itself, but just be aware they have very, very special needs that can easily be accommodated though. Some animals will nest in trees or cactus, such as our saguaro. We know that a lot of our winged creatures will take advantage of that, but also trees. There are some ground nesting birds as well. Making sure that you've kind of created a habitat that will welcome that nesting activity also. Don't be so quick to clean up things. If you have an agave that bloomed and has one of those big, thick bloom stalks, leave it. Or you could even cut it and make it secure in an area of the yard. Sometimes the woodpeckers will utilize that as a nesting spot. And also our native big carpenter bees might take up residence and do their nesting there. Our hummingbirds will utilize plant parts that are available in your landscape to build their nest. And one of their favorites seems to be our native desert lavender. That plant, the little structure called a calyx that surrounds the actual flower, is collected by the hummingbirds and they'll line their nest with it. So it's nice and fragrant and also very soft for their young when they hatch. The golden barrels with that velvety center, I've spotted cactus wrens, kind of pulling some of those tufts out to use in their nest building. Everybody likes a nice soft nest. And oh, those holes that you see in some of your leaves or maybe even the bracts of the flowers of your bougainvillea, that is the activity of the leafcutter bee. They are just collecting small bits of leaves to create a nest cell for their young. Animals need a place to roost and take a rest. Hummingbirds, they like more open spaces. They might perch on the branch of an ocotillo, or they love, it seems, dead branches on trees like desert willows. So don't be so quick, as I say, to always remove everything that seems dead in your landscape. You might have night roosters, the not literally chicken roosters, but roosting activity at night. The butterflies, they have to find a spot to just settle and be safe from weather and predators overnight. They might do that in trees or different locations. Also, during the day, owls are going to be roosting and taking their rest. Sometimes you might spot birds kind of warming up in the cold winter mornings, such as this example here. It's all fluffed up, waiting for the temperatures to rise. So the butterflies, so some of these have kind of specific needs that are easy to accommodate. Butterflies, the adults will need a lot of nectar. Flowers that are abundant, those that are in configuration of numerous little flowers in one grouping, such as sunflowers or daisies, will be great for them, and also kind of tubular flowers as well, but they have to have a place to land, a landing pad. They cannot hover and feed. They also need plant material to complete their life cycle. So we want to be able to feed the caterpillars. Yes, some parts of your plants will disappear, but it's worth the beauty of enjoying that cycle of life and also enjoying the adults that will visit your garden. We tend to spend a lot of time, especially in the warm season, out in our gardens in the evening or at night. So think about accommodating moths that will be enjoyable in your landscape. Plants that have very light colored flowers easily attract moths. They can spot them with even just the slightest amount of moonlight reflecting off of them. And they too, just like the butterflies, will need the accommodation of plant material to support the caterpillars as they develop and complete the life cycle of those moths. Bees have special needs. I mentioned their source of moisture or water. So many of our cactus flowers are wonderful for the bees. Even if the flowers open at night, while they're still open in the morning, they're still providing nectar and pollen for the bees to collect. All of our prickly pears, if you look at those, you will find so many, particularly native bees, gathering food from those flowers, and so many other plants that we would have in our landscape also. The globe mallow and superstition mallow, plants like this, they will be visiting on a regular basis once those plants begin to bloom. You could also put up some what we call bee houses. They're readily available these days for a lot of our native bee needs. Hummingbirds, they love those tubular flowers. Anytime you have things in bloom and they discover your garden, they will be visiting practically everything for their nectar needs. The lizards are great at helping control insects in your garden. If you can invite them in, they can really be helping, but you want to make sure you leave some leaf litter for them. By having some leaf litter, that's cover for little insects, which will feed the birds and the lizards. Also, they like sunspots, sunning spots for when the weather is a little bit cooler. So having rocks or branches or things where they can hang out and warm up in the morning is a good idea. And you want to keep these creatures safe. So limit all of the pesticide use and be careful. Even something that's organic could affect these wildlife forms in a negative fashion. If you limit your chemical use, you'll have the lizards and toads and other creatures, especially beneficial insects, come in and help keep bad insect populations under control. Now I want to visit a few plants that you might consider. And it's so hard to narrow down a list of plants, but I chose some that are multi-purpose for different forms of wildlife. Looking at some trees, the desert willow has such a long bloom period during the warm season from around April or May right on up to October. The flowers will accommodate the needs of hummingbirds and bees, including those big carpenter bees. The seed that forms at the end of the bloom cycle is a source of food for seed-eating birds. And those favored dead branches that the hummingbirds seem to like are a good perching spot also. With our native little leaf Palo Verde, the flowers are visited by bees. The seed that is produced is eaten by a number of different birds and other wildlife forms such as those little ground squirrels. The yellow bells, we have so many of those available these days. They are, again, long blooming to lure in the hummingbirds to your garden, and also the pollinator bees will visit, and the seeds are a good source of food. So think in terms, there are cultivars or cultivated varieties of the desert willow or the yellow bells that are available that don't produce seed, they're sterile. But those, they'll accommodate the hummingbirds, but not that big range of wildlife. We're not going to be accommodating the seed-eating birds that way. With one of my favorites, now this is a large shrub that can get easily about 8 feet tall and wide, but the bee brush, when it starts blooming early spring, the tiny little cream color flowers will attract butterflies, hummingbirds, pollinator bees. Once flowers are pollinated, the tiny, tiny, tiny seed that develops is a great source of food for especially finches. It might be house finches in your area or perhaps goldfinches. So you have multiple different wildlife forms being accommodated, and the flowers are so sweet smelling. They're so enjoyable. Our native fairy duster. Now it doesn't have that expanded practically year-round bloom that the red fairy duster has. You could use either of these, but our pink fairy duster will produce flowers that will attract butterflies, hummingbirds, and bees. The seed that develops is a good source of food for seed-eating birds and other little ground squirrels and other creatures like that. Keep in mind, the way you maintain your plants will be very, very important. If you're consistently shearing your shrubs, most likely you are eliminating a big portion of the bloom, so disadvantage to the wildlife, and also any seed that might be produced. So back off of that. Let your plants grow more naturally. If you've made a good selection of your plants, you won't have to keep downsizing them to make them fit in the landscape. They'll be able to grow to their mature size with all of their glory throughout the year, providing for wildlife. The brittle bush, a brilliant, brilliant, literally brilliant spring bloomer with its golden flowers. The flowers are wonderful for butterflies, and they produce oodles of seed that are wonderful for seed-eating birds. Now the thing is, birds will visit the maturing flower heads, seed heads, on the plant, but if seed drops to the ground, animals can still eat that, only if you're not overwatering. If you have mass water delivery all around your brittle bush, you will end up with a very nuisance-like forest of little seedlings of your brittle bush popping up. If you control the water and just have it going to the root zone of your plant, there will be fewer, if any, of those seed germinating, and they will be left for the birds to eat and take advantage of. Our native desert lavender, the flowers on your desert lavender, they're very tiny, purplish in color. They have a stupendous bloom in the spring, also with intermittent rains, and again in the fall. So a good number of days of these beautiful little delicate purple flowers will provide nectar for the hummingbirds and the butterflies and the bees. I mentioned that once flowering has occurred, those little structures that enclose or surround the flower can be used for hummingbirds to line their nests. And the tiny seed that these produce is also a good source of food for the seed eaters. Tuberosa, this is a long bloomer. They will start blooming in fall, usually around late fall, October sometimes, but definitely by November they will kick into bloom with these lovely tubular flowers. the flowers attract so many hummingbirds to your garden. They will continue blooming usually through April, even into May in the following spring. So you have several months of these beautiful flowers. More often we have them in the red blooming form, but they are also available in yellow blooming varieties. But that long bloom for the hummingbirds especially is so wonderful. So you're kind of trying to see, are you starting to see that with a nice selection of plants, you can have things in bloom and producing seed basically at all times of the year for your wildlife needs. There are a couple of lyciums or thornberries that are wonderful. This is another large-scale shrub that will get at least 6 to 8 feet in height and spread, and it has just a gnarly, dense branching form that is wonderful shelter for different wildlife to kind of hide and be protected. At least 2 times a year, you'll have a bloom cycle with these small lavender color flowers that will, oh, you're probably getting tired of this. It'll attract the butterflies, the hummingbirds, and the bees. Once pollinated, you have fruit develop that is a wonderful source for the fruit-eating birds in our areas. This is the Lycium excertum. There is another species, Lycium fremontii. They're so similar in their looks. They can be super drought tolerant, but if you make sure to give them a good soaking about every 2 weeks or so in the summer, they'll maintain their leaves and keep producing more regularly in cycle 2, sometimes 3 times a year, those flowers and fruit that we see here. So, you know, here's proof that the flowers do attract the butterflies and the hummingbirds. Also, the finches. During the hottest, driest part of the summer, finches might nibble on the leaves. And you can see here we have some stems that are denuded of foliage. And it seems like they'll kind of perch in one area and eat those leaves. Leaves will return, new foliage will develop in a few weeks or a month or so, so it's no impact to the health of the plant. So those birds, I think they're getting the moisture from the leaves and also that food source that you see. We have some wonderful ground covers and vines. The trailing smoke bush or trailing indigo bush is a super drought tolerant, sun worshiping ground cover. It has a magnificent bloom in the spring, also again in the fall, and a little bit of bloom scattered through the summer and winter even. The butterflies are very much attracted to the flowers. Also, pollinator bees will visit. The passion vines, we have native species as well as this one that isn't quite native but does very well here in our extreme heat and sun. So a range of these passion vines will accommodate, I think, a very important life cycle of the Gulf fritillary. These butterflies are just stupendous. Looks like somebody on the undersides of their wings took some silver paint and made a lovely design. Once they lay the eggs on the plant, little caterpillars hatch and they will start munching on the foliage until they feed enough to pupate and complete their life cycle. So many of these creatures, so many of these butterflies or other insects have very fascinating life cycles that I think are very enjoyable to observe in the landscape when you're out and about. Our native verbena, the Gooding verbena, it smells so wonderful. Petunias smell like our native verbena blooms. These will attract a range of our native bees as well as butterflies. Just dynamite bloom in the spring, usually again in the fall, unless we're super dry during the summer. But these are great. They can take a good amount of sun. They're more drought tolerant than the non-native verbenas that are available for our landscapes. A range of lavenders, which originate from the Mediterranean region, where conditions are quite similar. You know, the high temperatures, the very mineral, low organic soils, they do very wonderfully here as long as you give them a really, really good drainage. There is probably the longest blooming lavender, the fern leaf, that will attract, as all of the lavenders will, the hummingbirds, the butterflies, and the pollinator bees. So I think enjoying some of the lavenders as well as providing for wildlife by including some of them in your landscape is a great idea. And make sure, as I said, they need a well-draining soil and a good amount of sun through the day. The Blackfoot daisy has a wonderful fragrance when in bloom, which is most of the year. The butterflies will certainly visit those flowers to gather nectar. Needs well-draining soil. Here's one for the moths. The white-tufted evening primrose will bloom spring into earlier midsummer, and usually it'll pick up with more blooms in the fall. These gorgeous 3 or 4 inch wide white flowers open in the evening, surprised by the name. And these will attract the magnificent white-lined sphinx moth. The moth also uses this as a larval food plant. We have a range of penstemons that will provide a great source of nectar for the hummingbirds. This is just one. I chose this as an example because it has a very long bloom period from around February to May or sometimes even June. And it can take more sun than a lot of the other spring bloomers once we get into the summer heat. Here is a long bloomer, kind of blooms in the cycles, flower, seed, that is great in sunny locations. It will attract a nice variety of butterflies to your garden. Don't forget wildflowers. A lot of our wildflowers, such as the lupins and so forth, are larval food plants. The native sunflower is a larval food plant as well. The flowers will attract butterflies. Mature seed in any of our sunflowers is a great source of food for a lot of different birds. And here you see kind of gnarly looking caterpillars of this wonderful bordered patch butterfly. So you lose some foliage, but these border patches are able to complete their life cycle with our native sunflowers. You've got to have some milkweed. We want to make sure that there are good food sources for the monarchs especially, but also our queen butterflies to complete their life cycles. The best for around here in the valley is the desert milkweed. It's drought tolerant. It has to be in full sun location though. If not, it will be floppy and leggy and doesn't have that beautiful sculptural form. These bloom all through the warm season with those kind of characteristic funky milkweed flowers. The flowers will attract adult butterflies, and the queen and monarch will lay their eggs. They will feed on the tender plant parts, such as the just barely present fine leaves that occur on new growth. Flower buds, young flower pods are eaten by these caterpillars, but these bloom so prolifically through the warm season that you probably won't even miss them. Also, the really wild and menacing looking tarantula hawk wasp will visit the flowers. They're probably one of the best pollinators for our desert milkweed. The saguaros are magnificent. So they will have so many accommodations for a range of wildlife, especially a lot of birds. They will provide nesting as well as food sources from their flowers and the fruit that matures. Most often the fruit is only enjoyed by birds because it's rare that fruit that's uneaten falls to the ground. But that is just a wonderful plant. It's iconic of our region, but also so accommodating to a range of wildlife. We have a few native barrel cacti here. Now, unlike the golden barrel from down in Mexico, our natives tend to kind of grow from a globular or round form more into a cylinder. The fishhook barrel is spectacular when it's in bloom. The flowers begin usually around midsummer and continue. They'll develop ring after ring of bloom in succession, and the same thing occurs with the fruits. The fruits are very colorful, the flowers are colorful. Make sure you put these in a good amount of sun. You'll have the pollinator bees visit the flowers, and then different wildlife forms will take advantage of the fruits. They're loaded with very nutritious seeds for different animals. The range of prickly pears also are wonderful. The flowers are great for accommodating our native bees especially, as well as the fruits. So many different animals will be able to enjoy those luscious fruits, including this animal. I love to eat when I'm in the garden, I admit it. The fruit of the Arizona Queen of the Night is another wonderful source of fruit for those fruit-eating birds. The flowers open at night, so they will be accommodating night pollinators. And the flowers, usually they open around late June or early July. The fragrance is just exquisite. It's very unique and just so enchanting. If you can include one of these in your garden, I would definitely recommend it. It does need some shade. The range of plants, as I say, is so tremendous. Just look around. You have a lot of wonderful sources. If you visit the AMWA, amwua.org website, they have a great amount of resources there online to help guide you through your experience in xeriscaping, and you have a wonderful booklet that's online and has search features to help you figure out which plants will be best suited for your landscape project. And those search features include wildlife. So I hope you enjoy a lot of these desert plants as well as the wildlife you're going to be attracting to your garden. Thank you.